in the Easter holidays, I went with a group of friends to West Wales, and we played beach cricket. Basically, what happened was I was running across the beach, and my sort of right foot when it landed on one bit of sand, it sort of moved up a little bit quicker than it usually would do. And looking back on it, I thought that maybe it was a slightly sharper than usual pebble. A few minutes later, I sort of glanced behind me, and there was sort of a serpentine, sort of snake-like object. Yeah, it was a bit of wire that was attached to a large rusty fish hook that had lodged in the ball of my foot. And then that's when the pain started. So that was quite interesting. And then when all of my friends came over, I was sort of showing off because it looked quite impressive. The pain reduced. And then when I went to the harbour wall to think about, should I go to A&E or should I try and prize it out at the moment, the pain went up. And just the very process of me trying to think about how I was going to get the hook out of my foot made it go up to, a 9 out of 10. So that was that, and then it healed. It healed completely. And then about a year later, I was on a beach nearby with my family. Suddenly I had the most horrendous pain in my right foot and all of my right foot that made me jump off the sand and crash on the beach and grab hold of my foot. The brain had said, okay, we're on a beach in West Wales. Oh, what happened this time last year? Yeah, Monty's skin barrier was breached by a very infectious, probably object. So the brain decided to create pain, and that's often what happens. I mean, that's quite a mild example of what happens in persistent pain. The brain takes memories, but also the increase of sort of danger signals that come through to the brain after pain during the healing process and beyond the healing process, makes the brain on hyper alert any other kind of pain.
Doctor's Kitchen. Recipes, health, lifestyle.
And Monty, I'm really excited to chat to you because I haven't read your first book. Was it your first book?
Yeah, that's good.
But I've read this one, as you can tell. I got the early copy, and I remember, it's well leafed. I remember just folding so many pages that I need to look into this. This is absolutely fascinating. But I wanted to start actually by asking you about how you got into writing in itself, because you write so well. And I wonder if this is a skill that's something that you developed early on, or where did this love of writing come from?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when I was at school, I didn't know whether I wanted to do medicine or science or do something where I'd do more writing. Something that I loved philosophy, I loved history, I loved literature. But there was this moment in one of my biology classes. I had a great biology teacher where he got us to write an essay on, I think the essay title was "Are Viruses Alive?" And it really got me into sort of understanding that there is deep sort of philosophy, deep richness to biology, the natural world, the human body. And then I decided to go down the medicine route, and hoping that maybe I could be doing some writing along the side. I never thought I'd end up writing books. And I think that my latest book on pain, it wasn't even a book. During medical school, I wasn't that interested in pain. Pain was a sort of a symptom of more interesting diseases, I thought. But actually, there are a number of episodes in my career as a junior doctor that made me realize, actually, I think we completely misunderstand pain. And I wanted to communicate that to people. And for me, I most naturally do that through writing, sort of the long form. So I started sort of getting a manuscript together for that.
Yeah. And we've spoken to Dr. Deepak Ravindran, who I understand as well. You've written about great in your final chapter. Yeah. He's an amazing chap. I wonder, just to anchor the listener, we could go into exactly what we mean by pain. I know we've discussed this before, but I think for this is particularly pertinent because it frames everything else that we're going to be talking about that you've eloquently written in the book. So what do we mean by pain?
I mean, there are lots of different definitions of trying to get to what pain is. People often, when I told people I was writing about pain, they said, "Oh, you're going to be talking about sort of emotional pain and things like that." I'm just focusing on what we sort of sort of we tend to term sort of physical pain, quote unquote, but actually pain is simply a horrible feeling in our body that urges us to protect a body part. That's all pain is. And that's the core of what pain is. And it can be short term, which is known as acute pain, but it can also persist for months and years and decades, and that's traditionally been termed chronic pain. I and lots of other people in the area prefer to call it persistent pain, because chronic sort of a lot of people don't really know what it means, and it can be quite a defeating word to a lot of people as well. So I think persistent pain is, I prefer to use that. But yeah, acute pain, so short-term pain and chronic pain are very different beasts.
Yeah. And you talk about this concept of injury not being necessary nor sufficient for pain. And I wonder if we could sort of dive into that a bit more, because most people, when they come across pain, it's in the physical sense, and it's a response to a physical mechanism, but that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, and that was the amazing discovery that, well, it wasn't my discovery, but when I realized it as a junior doctor and I looked at the research, it was just amazing that most of us completely misunderstand pain. And by most of us, I mean lots of people in the medical field as well. We quite understandably assume that pain is an accurate measure of tissue damage, that there are sort of pain receptors and pain pathways that go to your brain, like sort of ringing a bell. So you pull the end of a rope and then a bell rings at the end. And for a lot of short-term pain, that makes sense. You slam your thumb in your laptop, it hurts a little bit. You slam it in a car door, it hurts a lot more. But actually the relationship between injury and pain in chronic pain, in persistent pain, in long-term pain is not so clear-cut. And actually many cases, perhaps the majority of cases of persistent pain that's lasted beyond the time that the wound should usually heal, so that's often sort of 3 to 6 months, it varies. Pain that goes on for years, often whatever caused the initial injury has completely healed, or has mostly healed, but pain has become wired in the brain. And the critical thing is, I'm not saying it's all in your head. It's become wired in the brain. It's neurological. It's as real as epilepsy. But that means that the whole approach to it is completely different. If I can, basically there's a story, and a patient that I saw in my first year as a junior doctor that I'd like to share. This is sort of the moment that I realized that this isn't just like an academic misunderstanding. It affects the lives of millions of people. So I was in my first year as a junior doctor. I've changed some of the details. So it's but so basically I was on an acute medical unit. So basically it was the step. So if you go to A&E with a problem, you're then sent to either an acute medical unit if you've got a medical problem, or a surgical unit if you've got a surgical problem, and other units potentially. And what we do is we go and see all the different the patients who'd come to us from A&E, and I would sort of chase after the consultant with a sort of a pile of notes, like hurriedly scribbling what he was saying very quickly, and seeing the patients and deciding whether they need to go to another ward and stay in the hospital, or whether they could be discharged home. And there was a patient, let's call him Paul, who was an IT worker in his mid-40s, who had terrible back pain, and he'd had it for over 6 months. It started in the sort of lower left side of his back, and it progressively got worse over 6 months. It got worse in intensity, it had become constant, and it spread across his back. And because of that, basically, he'd lost his job, and he was, over the last couple of weeks, he was going through a divorce, essentially, partly related to the pain. And that morning, he was in so much pain, he couldn't get out of bed, ended up calling an ambulance, went to A&E, and for various reasons, the doctors wanted to sort of rule out all of the causes of the back pain. So we had loads of blood tests, an MRI scan, and all the results came back completely normal. So then when I came to this patient with the consultant. The consultant looked at the computer, looks at the notes, and said to Paul, "The good thing is there's nothing physically wrong with you." And then Paul, who was still clutching his lower back, beads of sweat running down his face, said, "Are you saying it's all in my head then?" And I can't quite remember what the consultant said, but I mean, it was a really, really good consultant, but it was a bit of a fudge, I think. And the patient was sent home with some painkillers. And I sort of realized, I mean, looking back on it, I realized that the patient was either thinking that the pain is in his body, so there's something that the doctors can't detect, there's some horrible thing going on that the doctors can't detect that's causing his pain, or it's sort of all in his head. So it's sort of some kind of thought disorder that he can just quite easily think away. And I think that's the problem, because actually if it's become wired in his brain, if it's neurological, if it's physical and mental and completely real, there is another way to address this. And I think sort of modern medicine has real difficulties with that.
Yeah. And this is really a spillover effect, I think, from the separation of mind and body, and that we've essentially been taught that structure during med school. And I wonder if we can dive into that example that you gave there, because I think this plays out in so many different scenarios across the healthcare system in this country and others, of course, as well, in many different ways. Because I think if you can't find that physical manifestation of pain, people feel either dismissed, or that there's something that we've missed, or the suggestion that this is psychological, ergo you have a mental health problem, you need to focus on that, and there's nothing that we can do. Whereas actually, I think what your book and the research now beautifully explains is that it's almost like a continuum. It's like you can have that initial stressor that can be physical, but then that leads to other things like rewiring of the brain, such that the pain is absolutely real. I mean, there's no way that the pain can't be real if you've got beads of sweat going down your face and you're clutching your back as well. It's very, very real. But the way in which we treat it has to be reimagined. It has to be changed.
Completely. And I think one of the ways in which persistent pain is tried to be treated by doctors over the past half century and beyond has been through painkillers and opioids for strong pain, which are miraculous in short-term pain, but very rarely are the only solution in long-term pain, and in most cases aren't the solution. And that, combined with various things, has resulted in the overprescription of opioids. I'm not saying that opioids shouldn't be prescribed, because they can be very helpful, but there are other ways. And I think understanding what pain is very important. So I think understanding that pain isn't a detector, it's not an accurate detector of tissue damage, but it's a protector, it's a protective mechanism. So the brain is always trying to decide from inputs in the environment, from past experience, and what it thinks is going to happen, is trying to protect us. And in many cases, it can become overprotective. So say you have that some kind of sort of injury in your back that heals. The brain is going to be very, very protective of the spinal cord, even though it's incredibly, incredibly tough. And a combination of the signals, if pain persists, can become sort of, it's called central sensitization. Basically, the brain, it becomes sensitized so that any kind of signal, even if it's not a danger signal, can start to cause pain, and it gets worse and it can stay longer. And the brain essentially becomes sort of rewired. And then negative thoughts associated with that, beliefs that your back is crumbling, the very thought of that, even sometimes seeing MRI scans, which I'll go on to in a second, they don't actually often show very much, can make pain worse and can make people go down this horrible spiral. And I think with them MRI scans of backs, there have been lots of studies where they've done MRI scans of people who have no pain at all, and roughly 20% of, I say 40% of 20-year-olds, and almost all 80-year-olds have some signs of disc degeneration, and no pain at all. And also things like elements of what looks like a slipped disc and things like that are very common in people without any pain. And often these are sort of medically as important as wrinkles. But obviously there are more serious back damage that can cause pain in the long run. But I think that's key. And another important thing that I need to make clear is that the receptors that say in our skin that say if you burn your finger, that transmits a signal to your brain and that pain is created, that's actually not necessarily a pain signal. So it's called nociception, which is essentially danger detection. So they're danger signals. Your unconscious brain has to decide whether these danger signals are worth causing pain. And these signals are neither necessary nor sufficient for causing pain. So there are some quite sort of in the pain field, some quite well-known examples of sort of pain being caused without injury and the opposite. So for example, so just to get some clear examples of why injury isn't pain, there's a case study, and there are some other case studies like this, of a British builder in the about 20 years ago or so, who was climbing down the scaffolding from a building, decided to jump the last few meters, landed on a wooden plank, but it was a wooden plank with a sort of, I think it was a 15-inch or maybe a bit smaller nails sticking out of it, and went straight through his boot, through one side and out the other side. He was in absolute agony. Went to A&E, ended up having fentanyl, which is a very, very powerful opioid, a lot more powerful than morphine, and he has to have a sedative as well. He was just in absolute agony. The surgeons very carefully cut the boot off to reveal that the nail had gone between his toes and hadn't damaged any skin whatsoever. And then you've got cases of, so the brain very understandably had predicted that the foot was in damage, or the foot was in danger or damaged, and created pain. And there have been some other studies where subjects have had sort of a head stimulator put over their heads, but it's a sham, and they were told that they're going to have sort of currents delivered through the head stimulator that will cause headaches. And in most people, it did cause a headache, even though there wasn't actually any current going through it. And then you've got cases of soldiers in the battlefield who are shot and don't feel, and the body decides in that moment that pain is not as important as getting off the battlefield. So if the bottom line is survival, in most cases, the body wants to be a pessimist. The body wants to create pain. But in very extreme cases, actually getting yourself off the battlefield is more important in the short term than actually having pain. So I think it boils down to understanding that it's a protector. The brain is pain is a protector, not a detector. And then if you're thinking about treatment, an equation is essentially anything that increases safety, increases cues of safety to your brain over the long run can reduce pain. Anything that increases cues of threat increases pain.
Yeah. And that's a really good formula, I think, for us to stick with in our minds, I think, as if anyone's listening to this, because this comes to fruition in lots of different ways when you talk about society, loneliness, sense of purpose, all these different things that give us warmth and security can dictate the levels of pain that we perceive. And I just wanted to go into one of those case studies. I think in the extreme example of the builder who expects that the nail has gone through the foot and therefore perceives quite, literally there's a excruciating pain when actually there is no physical injury. That expectation, I think, is quite key. And you've actually dedicated a whole chapter to the expectation effect. And I don't know if you can remember, but because there's so many studies that you talk about in the book, but there was one that really stood out to me, which is about changing the brain through expectation and hope. And it was the wisdom tooth trial where they used fentanyl, naloxone, and saline. Would you mind telling us a bit about that? Because I found that like incredible to read.
I think, yeah, it's such an interesting area, the whole area of what's sort of traditionally termed sort of placebo effect, and the opposite of it, which is the nocebo effect. So if you think you're going to be in more pain than you will. But as you rightly said, the expectation effect is a better term, and I think this is so much relevance for all interactions between anyone. It's not necessarily a doctor and a patient. It can be anyone and someone else who's in pain, basically. And I think there's a huge responsibility for people who are need to look out for people and help people who are in pain, because it's so hard to do these things on your own. So the wisdom teeth study is really interesting, and it shows how kind of fear and confidence are so contagious. So essentially, there were two groups of dentists doing a wisdom tooth operation on patients, and one group of dentists were told that to sort of the injection they were giving around the wisdom tooth was either going to be a placebo, or it was going to be an opioid sort of analgesic, so that they knew that the patient will, the 50% chance of the patient not being in pain. So 50% chance of the patient having pain relief, 50% chance of it being a placebo. And then the other group was split into either placebo or basically naloxone, which is something that definitely blocks. You definitely, like, you won't have any pain relief with that because it blocks opioid receptors. And essentially, the dentists who knew that there was a 50-50% chance, a 50-50 chance of them having pain relief, in the placebo section of their patients, they experienced pain relief. But in the other half of the dentists, in their placebo group, because the dentists knew, and the dentists couldn't tell the patients anything, that's an important thing. In the placebo section of the other group, where they were either getting placebo or definitely not pain relief, the placebo group experienced pain, like worsening pain. So what that means is essentially the non-verbal cues, the kind of the confidence that the dentist had, and knowing what they were potentially giving the patient, was transmitted to the patient, and the patient ended up experiencing more pain, basically, even though they were having a placebo. And I think that is hugely important, that in the fact that clinicians really need to be so supportive and hopeful with patients. And I think a lot of sort of psychological and sort of combined psychological and sort of functional therapies that are being used for persistent pain, the ones that work have a combination, I think, of acceptance, being realistic about things and where you are at the moment, but also hope for the future and that things can change. And I think conveying hope, conveying care, conveying love is medicine in and of itself.
Absolutely. That particular example and that particular study really stood out to me as a clinician as well, because those nonverbal cues, those little ways in which we describe things, the way we describe an X-ray, the way we describe a treatment, all these things are literally having an effect. And I think this particular study should be discussed amongst junior clinicians in particular, because it really would stay with me throughout my career as to how I interact. Even taking the example of the consultant and the person who came in with back pain, for example. And I think the reason why I wanted to talk about this is because I understand you've had your own experience with IBS, something that you suffered with for quite a while now, where you were given a sugar pill, essentially a homeopathic treatment, and you know about how homeopathy has been debunked, and your skepticism was already there, so you weren't expecting any effect. But I'm assuming the giver of said medication was a true believer of this pill, and that somehow is transferred. And I'd wonder if you'd share that story with us, because I thought that was super powerful.
Oh yeah, this was sort of mind blowing for me. At the time, and more so looking back on it, so for as long as I can remember, I've had IBS, which has sort of ranged from sort of a bit of an irritation to like not being able to get out of bed, basically, which has been, I've actually been basically almost been completely cured through sessions of hypnotherapy, which is another story. But when I was younger, I was having a particularly bad episode. I think it was a Sunday afternoon in a family home. I'm not going to sort of mention who the person who gave the homeopathic pill was, but it was someone, a family member I love dearly, who said, "Oh, you should take this pill, like this homeopathic pill, for your IBS." And I was, and homeopathy remained skeptical about its claims, and I think just to sort of to please them, I took the pill. It was in this sort of packet with this sort of faux Latin name on it, and it was this little, what I assumed, and I still assume, was a sugar pill, and took it anyway. And my IBS was completely cured, well, at least for that day. And there have been some really, so I think that's what you mentioned about the kind of the transferring of that hope and that love was a huge element of it. And there's also another whole new area of research which is emerging, which is really interesting, called sort of open label placebos, so honest placebos. So could you give people placebos, telling them that it's a placebo, but through various sort of mechanisms, it can actually reduce pain. And there have been some studies that show that it is quite effective in say IBS is one example, but some other types of pain. I'm not at the moment suggesting that it's a good solution to pain, but it might have roles in, say, for example, if people are tapering off something like opioids or sort of other medications, sort of interspersing it with honest placebos might have a role. But the fact that it works at all is quite interesting. And again, the theories behind it, again, it's very, how could a placebo work if you know that it's a placebo? Perhaps an element of it is our predictive brain, and a lot of the predictive brain is in areas of our brain associated with doing things, and not just sort of thinking about things, not just the cognitive bit. So it's emotions, it's rituals, it's things like that. So actually the very process of just taking the pill, even if you have doubts about it working, can have some kind of healing process. The extent of that, we yet to find out, but it's really interesting, and I think it's sort of bolstering the theory that actually, that our brain is a predictive machine, and actually we can try and hack that in a sense to try and help people with persistent pain.
Yeah, you mentioned hypnotherapy as well, and I wanted to talk about this. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think there's an expectation that hypnotherapy works for people who are more suggestible than others, and it's a particular person that would respond best to hypnotherapy. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, because you've experienced hypnotherapy yourself. I think it's one of the things that has led to healing in your case. And I guess this ties into the emotional brain and how that can be used and harnessed to reduce pain overall, like back pain as well.
Yeah, definitely. So, and that's a really interesting question about sort of susceptibility to hypnosis or to hypnotherapy, and I think there's a lot of debate in that area. But so basically, I was researching the book a couple of years ago, and I saw that I researched basically any kind of cure for my IBS, and often it's, in many cases it's mainly dietary, which is a cause of it, but in many cases it's often it's a case of both. It's the brain and the gut, that they're so interlinked, and the gut affects the brain massively, and the brain also affects the gut. But in mine, it seemed to predominantly be related to distressful events. And yeah, so I went to this hypnotherapist, not to have any hypnotherapy myself, but to interview him about hypnotherapy for the book. And he said, "Oh, what do you have any sort of pain issues, pain or anything like that?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I've had IBS for a bit." And we did a session, and he recorded it, and then I took the recording home, and sort of for 10, 20 minutes every morning did this hypnotherapy, and I'll explain a bit more about what it is. And didn't do anything for about a month. But then after about 6 weeks, it started to get better. And then in 2-3 months afterwards, it's only come back sort of once or twice when I was very, very stressed. So I was just absolutely blown away by it. And I think a lot of people have kind of sort of quite odd, I'd never been taught about hypnotherapy at med school. I was very dismissive of it. I thought of hypnotherapists as sort of people on stages getting audience members to come up and sort of cluck like chickens, or things like that, or it seemed quite sinister, taking over someone's brain and taking control away from them. But it's not like that at all. It's essentially getting you to just completely to relax and to direct the focus of your attention in different ways. And then through that, the suggestions of the hypnotherapist, the theory is that you're more likely to take on what they're saying on board. It's what I had essentially was quite similar to a sort of a very relaxing type of CBT with visualization. I think I don't want to say that hypnotherapy is a miracle cure for everyone, because it's not. And there are lots of different types of sort of talking therapies, so some people are evangelists for specific ones, but actually I think there are a number that are shown to be beneficial with people with persistent pain, and it might be different for other people, for specific people. But I think they need to convey a sense of safety and a sense of hope as well. But the interesting thing about the hypnotherapy I had was it focused a lot on visualization, and I think visualization is really, really useful, because a large part of our brain is dedicated to visual processing. And my IBS had become sort of etched on my brain. It had become rewired on my brain. And I thought, what's a good way of tackling this is actually through using sort of visualization and visual cues to kind of to sort of steal back my brain. And so essentially what it got me to do when I was sort of relaxed and focusing on different sort of elements of the environment around me or my body was to imagine my sort of intestines as a rocky rapids, and then to gradually enter, whenever I have a flare up, to imagine them as sort of, so I live near a very sort of relaxed bit of the Thames, just sort of the languid Thames, as sort of punts floating down it, and just that very kind of crude sort of visual change. But doing that sort of religiously for a while really did work. And there have been a number of cases of so there was a quite prominent pain doctor called Michael Moskowitz in the US, who had horrendous pain, and what he did was horrendous sort of persistent neck pain. And what he essentially did, he did loads of research, and he ended up drawing a picture of his brain and all the areas where sort of the pain areas of the brain, there's not a specific pain area, but areas that are associated with pain, and he drew them in sort of red and sort of overgrown and covering most of his brain. And then he had another picture of those areas shrinking. And what he did is he just, whenever he had a flare up, he imagined those areas shrinking. And it didn't work for months, but after a lot of persistence, it actually did work. And that's a very extreme example, and I don't think that should be a first line treatment for persistent pain necessarily, because it's using that kind of using visualization and cognitions in that sense can be very hard work, and doesn't work for everyone. But maybe things like virtual reality might help with that.
Yeah.
And different types of therapy might be able to sort of harness visualization to help reduce pain.
Yeah. You when you were describing that story, you used the word rewire there, and I think it lends itself to a bit of a conversation around neuroplasticity and how, and you not to go on about all the various afflictions that you might have had in your life, but you start the book by talking about how you stepped on a fish hook. And obviously that was very painful at the time. You had an injury, you had that treated, but at some point later down the line, a small stimuli elicited quite an exaggerated response. And I think that's a nice way to talk about how your brain had essentially learnt to react in quite an exaggerated way to protect yourself. So all these concepts that we've talked about thus far are sort of coming into play here. And I wonder if we could talk about how those fibers are built and wired around that experience that can actually be dismantled, to use that word if I can, to reduce the experience of pain. Is that a good way to talk about neuroplasticity, perhaps?
Before I do that, I realised I didn't properly answer your last question about the sort of the susceptibility to hypnotherapy.
Oh, to hypnotherapy, yeah.
Well, there's a bit of evidence that 5-10% of people are like very susceptible, very kind of suggestible, and 5-10% of people aren't suggestible at all. Whether that means hypnotherapy won't work for those people in terms of, say, pain, it's up for debate. But I think for a lot of people, it could be a path worth chasing, or different types of therapies that are similar.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that the fish hook story was when I was in one of my first couple of years of medical school. In the Easter holidays, I went with a group of friends to West Wales, and we played beach cricket. And I like sport, but I'm not ball sports. I'm not very coordinated. So I was sent out right to the corner of the cricket pitch, or whatever they call it, on the beach, so I could sort of look at the scenery and not get too involved. Basically, what happened was I was running across the beach, and I didn't notice it at the time, but my sort of right foot when it landed on one bit of sand, it sort of moved up a little bit quicker than it usually would do. And looking back on it, I thought that maybe it was a slightly sharper than usual pebble. Didn't think anything of it until a few minutes later. I sort of glanced behind me, and there was a sort of a serpentine, sort of snake-like object, and the ground was behind me. So I jumped up, and assuming it was a snake, and actually it was a bit of wire that was attached to a large rusty fish hook that had got lodged in the ball of my foot. And then that's when the pain started. So that was quite interesting. And then when all of my friends came over, and like, oh, look at that, that's amazing. And I was sort of showing off because it looked quite impressive. The pain reduced. And then when I went to the harbour wall to think about, oh, should I go to A&E or should I try and prise it out at the moment, the pain went up. And just the very process of me trying to think about how I was going to get the hook out of my foot made it go up to, a 9 out of 10. So basically it was initially a 0.1 out of 10. Then it went up to a 7-8. Then when my friend saw it, it went down to a 5-6, and then went up to a 9-10. So that sort of made me think, okay, this is the same injury here, and pain is completely changing depending on the contextual cues. So that was that, and then it healed completely. And then about a year later, I was on a beach nearby with my family in a sort of similar part of Wales, and I was running along with my parents' dogs, and suddenly I had the most horrendous pain in my right foot, on the ball of my right foot, that made me jump off the sand and crash on the beach and grab hold of my foot. And there was maybe the tiniest scratch, but it was basically nothing at all from a stone or something like that. But my brain had looked at all the cues around me. So when that tiny sensation of when the danger signals came up from that, or not necessarily, just sort of pressure and danger signals came up from that little stone on the same place where I had the fish hook a year before, the brain had said, okay, where are we now? We're on a beach in West Wales. What happened this time last year? Yeah, Monty's skin barrier was breached by a very infectious, probably object. So the brain decided to create pain. And that's often what happens. I mean, that's quite quite a mild example of what happens in persistent pain. But the brain takes memories, but also the increase of sort of danger signals that come through to the brain after pain during the healing process and beyond the healing process, makes the brain on hyper alert for any other kind of pain, and trauma in the past can feed into that, and past experience can feed into that, and past pain and inflammation can feed into that. So essentially, what there's a phrase in some neuroplasticity that as neurons that fire together wire together. So essentially, if a particular path is used more often than other ones, then that will get stronger. And if it's not used, it's sort of use it or lose it. And in persistent pain, often even when the injury is completely healed, those paths can have already begun the state of sort of rewiring, and can become completely lodged in the brain. It's like sort of running. I like going for runs through a forest near where I live, and you can, if you follow one of the paths through the vegetation that lots of runners go down, then the path gets more consolidated. But if I start to go down somewhere where there's no path at all, then and I can do that every day over sort of weeks, months, sort of the vegetation will be sort of beaten down by feet, and a new path will be created. It's a slow and steady process, but that's how pain can get stuck in the brain. But it's also by understanding that, we can begin to actually reduce pain, in some cases completely eliminate it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good analogy and useful way of describing how neuroplasticity works. I think some of us have heard of that, neurons that fire together wire together, but that sort of patching down the grass and seeing these like well-trodden paths, I think that's a really nice way of conceptualizing it. I'd love to. I
was going to say, it's almost like, it's not quite like learning, but it's like whenever we learn a new instrument or a new language, we are consolidating different pathways, and
exactly,
in a sense, you can learn pain. I don't tend to like using that, because it suggests that you're actively trying to make the pain worse, but actually that pain becomes learned on the brain.
Yes,
it can become unlearned.
Yes. Actually, I was going to talk about this a bit later, but why don't we talk about those practices that you've put in the book to unlearn the pain? We talked about one of them, visualization, and I think it was Moskovitz. Is that his name? The person who had the researcher who had the neck pain, and through time and time, I think with one of the things with a lot of these practices is that it's a huge time commitment. It's not something as simple as taking a medication, which is obviously, I mean, we're obviously going to default to the path of least resistance. We're creatures of sort of like, ease these days. And I think this is, just to frame it for the listener, these are tough practices that will require lots of investment. But yeah, perhaps we could talk a little bit again about the visualization element and what modern techniques that you mentioned VR, that we could potentially be using in pain medicine to help people along the journey.
Yeah, that's a really good. I think you make a really good point that actually the visualization element is a time consuming, and it can be very effective, but can be a tricky one. And actually, I think, so I kind of, it's the book itself it's not a self-help book, but in the last chapter I focus on what I see as sort of evidence-based treatments for different types of persistent pain, and obviously everyone's pain is unique, so different things can work for different people. But I split it into sort of three things. It's the first one's alteration, so it's altering the environment of your brain, making your brain feel safe in its body. So that's not visualization necessarily. So that's one separate one. And then there's visualization, and then there's sort of education. So knowledge is power. And I think if I can maybe start with the first two before I look at visualization, potentially, just because I think the visualization ones might be at this point in time probably shouldn't necessarily be the first port of call, or if they are, they can be used alongside the other elements. So essentially, alteration, so making the brain feel safe in its body, are doing daily practice, doing things throughout the day that can essentially reduce pain and, as I said, make the brain feel safe in its body. So one of these, for example, is movement. And any kind of movement. Often when we're in pain, we can understandably not want to move at all. And in the past, sort of bed rest was recommended for lots of musculoskeletal issues. And actually, that's not, for most things, that's not actually very, for a short period of time, of course, that's important. But actually, starting to move really gradually within your abilities at the time, and just to persist with that is so important, because that is so exercise generally is reducing inflammation, and we can talk a bit more about inflammation maybe later on. But it's actually sending signals to your brain that your body is strong, your body is safe. And in most cases of persistent pain, the risk of not moving is much worse than the risk of moving. Obviously, with whatever pain condition you have, you talk to your doctor or clinician about the safety of being able to move. But in most cases, you're safe to move. Doesn't mean you need to go and prepare for a marathon, but it's just getting out and doing all kinds of movement. I spoke to Betsy Corkill, who she has done some amazing work and studies into knitting and pain, and actually has found that knitting essentially is an amazing way of rewiring the brain, because it's a repetitive movement. It uses sort of both sides of the body and sort of combines sort of visualization in a sense, actually, and but also movement, and slowly expanding your sort of your red zone, your area of safety, if that makes sense. So when you're in pain, often you can become really withdrawn because your brain's in sort of threat mode. But actually, it's sort of being able to slowly interact with the outside world. So that's movement. In a sense, things like breathing exercises. I won't go into too much detail, but they can be really, really helpful. And anything that, I mean, it's easy to say anything, reduce your stress, but with anything that reduces stress, can reduce pain, and can reduce inflammation as well. And often there's a sort of the 80-20 rule with that. So it's sort of, 80% of the effect of the stress reduction comes with 20% of the effort, focusing on the key things. And then diet is a huge element of that as well. It's like, I don't want to use too many analogies, but if our body is a beautiful garden, and with our diet we can sort of create good soil for it. And there are some very, again, we can go into a bit more detail if we have time, but there's some very basic things that one can do with their diet to reduce inflammation, because there's interesting research that suggests that the bridge between short-term pain and long-term pain can be accelerated by inflammation in the body and the brain. And actually, inflammation in the brain can worsen pain. So those are, and then also with sort of alteration, various different types of psychological therapies, but also there are some sort of newer therapies like pain reprocessing therapies that combine pain education with getting people to understand their pain and also start to move, and then also elements of sort of cognitive and behavioral therapy with that, which I think is very promising for the future. So those are some elements of altering the brain, sort of making the brain feel safe in its body. But I think the most important thing generally is pain education, is understanding what pain is and what it isn't. I think it's very hard to rewire a system you don't understand.
Yes.
And I don't think understanding your pain will cure your pain. Although there's some evidence that there's some sort of pain teaching courses, and very good ones, can actually reduce pain intensity. But I think that's the logical starting point. And there are lots of free resources out there, like Flipping Pain is a really good, relatively new national, essentially it's a sort of pain education group charity that are involved in sort of educating people, and there are some amazing resources that they have online. And then there are also some apps that some people find quite useful. So there's one called Curable, which has some its internal evidence from the app. So I don't know how, but there are lots of people who find it very useful, and that kind of uses pain education and sort of daily practices, just essentially focusing on sort of rewiring your brain. So I think pain education and I think pain education for clinicians as well in medical schools.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's so key, and I think that's that's a really important area that I think just everyone in society needs to understand these things, and understanding actually that social injustice worsens pain. So basically anything that increases your sense of threat can worsen pain, and the very things that torturers do to make pain worse, even without minimal physical injury, things like isolation, verbal abuse, making a humiliation, dejection, is something that can worsen pain, and is exactly the same thing that happens with people who are marginalized by society or people who are isolated. There are some interesting studies that a big one in Sweden in 2020 that showed that migrants to Sweden, regardless of race, were more likely to have pain condition, sort of chronic pain conditions, and people of the same race who have moved from, say, so there's one study of, this is a bit of a smaller study, but of Indians who've migrated to America were more likely to have chronic pain than Indians from the same area of India back in India. And it's the element of this was first generation, but the idea of kind of injustice can have even conscious, very conscious, and also very subconscious effects on worsening pain. People who are isolated are much more likely to have pain. So I think there's a huge need for, we would call it social prescribing, but I think not just clinicians, but everyone has a responsibility to support people who are isolated in pain, get them to do things where they are moving, where there's interacting with other people, where they're laughing, they're singing in choirs and things like that, or getting involved in clubs and things like that. I think it sounds very woolly, but actually it's neuroscience.
Absolutely.
I think those are kind of the key things. Anything that can make the brain feel safe in its body can reduce pain. And then you've got visualization, which I think there are some specific things that it can be really useful for. So for things like phantom limb pain, and certain types of pain that are very limited to certain limbs in the body, things like the mirror boxes can be amazing. So that's also very, I won't go into too much detail, but essentially it's if you're missing, say you had a left arm amputated, what you do is you put your right arm into a box with a mirror in the middle of it, and it looks like you have your left arm in the box. And this is assuming that you have pain associated with your using your phantom limb pain. So usually the limb is sort of stuck in a position because your brain's rewired. It's quite a complex area, but basically seeing the very movements of the sort of phantom hand moving can actually sometimes completely eliminate the pain. And then VR can be really helpful. I think there's some studies that children who have had, so in the post-operative periods, they've had operations, need far less, who've been given sort of post-op VR sort of relaxation therapy sessions where they can choose to go to space or to a beach, or I think the jungle's another one or something like that. They need half the amount of opioids and they get out of hospital earlier, and presumably, I mean, there needs to be more research to recover better. So I think there is some hope for the visualization element of it, but I think there are some really low-hanging fruit that we can address. Just single little changes in people's lives can make big differences.
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, there's so much there that I want to pick out on there. So, I mean, if anyone's listening to this, I think you've eloquently described all the different areas that perhaps are overlooked today, but will become hopefully more commonplace. But if anyone knows anyone with pain or suffers with pain themselves, there are a few actionable things that you can do. Like you said, your book isn't designed to be a self-help book. I think it really leans into the education aspect of those three things that you said. I completely agree. I think better education about what pain actually is critical, because it helps you with all the other elements, the rewiring, the stories that you tell yourself, the understanding about the emotional connection with the severity of your pain, the other ways in which you can alter it using movement and breath work, I believe you talked about, and then the visualization element, which is quite an investment in time. The knitting element I found really fascinating, actually, the fact that these rhythmic movements can be related to serotonin release, and also that sense of community, I guess, it can be something that you do with people. And I wanted to ask actually about the loneliness aspect and how that can exacerbate pain. And also the connection between lack of social cohesion and pain. And I think we don't have as much of a problem in the UK, but certainly in the US, there is an opioid crisis. It's, it's certainly being pegged towards disparities in society as well, in marginalized communities. The age-old, I think it was like the Just Say No campaign. I think we're realizing how flawed that messaging was, because the root cause, when you go upstream, is not the availability of drugs and the opportunity to just say no. It's actually something far rooted in the societal aspects of why people choose to use pain relieving drugs.
Oh, that's so true. It's a tragic story, and that's a really good point, in that it's the people who are in pain and using these drugs are not given any in the present. They're not given any other option. But also there are huge societal issues that are driving this. That's been a terrible situation. And I think, so again, understanding in terms of social isolation, understanding things from a survival point of view, and that pain is a protector. The pain of rejection is very similar to pain itself. So there was a study done in 2015 at UCLA where they had people playing, apparently, a very, very boring online game called Cyberball, where essentially you're passing a ball between different people, I guess a bit like football. And then at some point, the sort of imagine the people you're playing with, you can't see them, but you're imagining that you're playing with them. They start passing to each other and don't pass to you. And they are also doing some brain scans at the same time, and they found that when you're playing this game with them, and when you're isolated and rejected, the same areas in your brain that light up when you're in quote unquote physical pain light up as well. And if you look at it from a protective point of view, if you are marginalized from a group, a tribe, people generally, your brain is going to go into protective mode, and that in and of itself is fuel for pain's fire. And then again, social isolation there are some epidemiological studies that say is as bad for your physical health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, due to various different things. And that sense of isolation is just being on your own, not being in a group, not being loved or recognized, or I guess sort of being able to have purpose and things like that, directly worsen pain and can make it much more likely for a short-term pain to become wired on the brain. So I think that's an enormous issue. And I think that's the very same methods that sort of people who inflict torture do to people. I interviewed a man, an Australian man called Evan, who was in the Australian SAS, and in 2006, essentially he was in a training camp in Australia and was essentially tortured. He was meant to be going through some kind of interrogation techniques, but the people who did it essentially abused and tortured him for about 96 hours until he passed out. And he actually didn't have very much sort of physical injury during that period, but he ended up having horrendous whole body pain for about for 7 years. And the only thing that really stopped the pain was when he finally won his court case against the Australian military. And it was just that sort of sense of, it's a slightly different thing than isolation, but it's just a sense of injustice. Being oppressed, caused whole body pain. He couldn't sort of go into a swimming pool or a bath that wasn't a certain temperature. He sometimes couldn't put his boots on. He was in so much pain. The brain had just gone into hyper vigilance, hyper protective mode. And there are some interesting studies that show that people who have a strong sense of justice, a strong sense that the world is, that there's good and bad, and these people, and people who are very sort of conscientious, actually they tend to have worse chronic pain, sadly, because and that when I read that study as well, I just thought, that should be a sort of a clarion call for clinicians, but for people to help people who are in persistent pain, because it's just, when you're in that position, it's not impossible, but it's impossible to do it on your own. It's so hard to do it on your own, and that's why I think there need to be whole societal structural changes, but also I think starting with education for everyone, I think is key.
I wrote that down in my mind, actually, that this sentence from your book: perceived injustice is like petrol for pain's fire. And that really just spoke to me, and something that you mentioned earlier as well, from my anecdotal experience working in different areas in London over the last 12 years. I've certainly seen people, and at the risk of confirmation bias, but I've certainly seen people from different backgrounds, migrants, have more sort of severe experiences with pain. And actually was quite a well-known phenomena in the various A&Es that I've worked in North and East London as well. I could honestly talk to you for so long. There's so many different elements of your book that have given me a new understanding of pain, particularly in one of the chapters, actually, where you talk about religion and the various interpretations from Buddhism and Christianity and Islam around their perception of pain and why we experience pain, and how it's sort of related to their faith. But I wanted to close actually by asking you a bit more about your writing process, because there's like a wonderful flow through your book. It's a great interplay of stories, being vulnerable and telling your personal stories, as well as a lovely sort of introduction to all these like rich studies that give us a better perspective on pain, all wrapped up nicely in the final chapter. How do you write? Like, talk me through that process. And you've got some great interviews as well, some incredible people. People who have genetic SNPs that mean that they don't experience pain. They have various issues. So talk me through that.
That's a really interesting question. I think this was just unusually for me, it was an unusually natural process of writing, in a sense that actually, when I had this sort of revelation to myself that actually pain is completely different to what I thought it was, and I wanted to have that as the core of the book. So I outlined that at the beginning, and then sort of bring it home at the end with evidence-based studies, so to make it practical at the end. But I think the best way of learning anything, I think, is with a story. I'm currently revising for some specialty exams at the moment, and some of the stuff I'm going through is just really boring bullet point stuff, and I'm just forgetting it all the time. And actually, if I'm read about it in a book or listen to it in a podcast, it's just and it's sort of told in a story. It's we're made to sort of tell and listen to stories. So I wanted to kind of bring out stories throughout the whole book, with the kind of the spine of it being knowing what pain actually is. It's a protective mechanism. It's not a detector of tissue damage. And then I wanted that to be through interesting studies. So I did do a big literature review beforehand, and also try and sort of I feel like a journalist, trying to find sort of interesting experiences with different patients who, if there's a point I want to make, a really interesting case study, potentially of very rare patients can be a really interesting way of understanding biology and psychology. So as you said, yeah, the patient, the very small number of people who don't feel any pain at all, and then I also, the good thing about in terms of the writing process is that I had some pain experiences myself, that actually it all just came together in that sense. And then the general idea, I wanted it to be sort of biopsychosocial. So I wanted it to have kind of I wanted to break down dualism, or what sort of I was saying earlier, and have that kind of as a theme throughout the whole book, but also have areas that are more sort of quote unquote biological, more sort of psychological, and more social, and then looking at things like religion. And I think I think it's just great to understand the whole body, the whole human. I love using things that kind of seem a bit. I did this with the skin book as well. So the skin was something that seems quite sort of mundane, and pain is something that we don't really want to talk about. And I wanted to use these things as prisms through which we can see the kind of the beauty of humanity and the body in society, or the positives, the negatives, and that was kind of the way I wanted to do it. But I think it definitely I found this very natural to do, because it was a genuine revelation to me that made me want to write the book. Whereas with the book about skin, which I loved writing, I had to be more sort of rigid and structured, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And you're working on a few other things at the moment. So moving towards psychiatry, but you're also an academic clinical fellow, and you have an interest in the gut-brain axis and the microbiota. Tell us a bit about that.
So I wasn't at med school. I wasn't interested in diet at all.
No, neither was I.
Really, you were really told about it, and it's and I was quite sporty when I was a teenager. Did triathlons and running and things like that, and I was always like, oh yeah, I sort of I eat to live. I don't live to eat. I can eat whatever I want because I'm really fit, which is probably a terrible thing for me at the time. And I didn't really think nutrition played that much of a role in physical health. But in all the so I'm really interested in the relationship between the body and the brain, and improving psychiatry through that lens, and actually looking at the relationship between the gut and the brain, and the effect that the gut has on the brain, and vice versa, is amazing. And I'm starting to try and get to grips with the gut microbiome. And the research that I might be doing is, are we trying to adjust the gut microbiome, whether it's by diet or prebiotics, or whether in certain groups it might be assisted with a medication potentially to improve cognition in different conditions, whether it's the things I'm interested in are people with psychosis and schizophrenia. A huge part of their life is ruined by reduction in cognition and not being able to task or remember things well. But also people living with long COVID, or long COVID, ME, post-viral syndromes, who have terrible sort of cognitive issues that seem to be largely related to inflammation. And if we alter the gut microbiome, then we can make huge leaps there. And actually, I've started to change my own diet over the last year, kind of because of that. And I found that I've actually noticed like huge changes in my energy, my alertness, and my overall mood and well-being through some minor changes, which are essentially eating lots of different types of plants, so increasing fiber to kind of feed my gut microbes, and sort of having more fermented food in my diet. And I'm planning to. I'll try and see if I can make more changes, but I'm trying to do things.
That's
gradually.
epic. That's epic.
So it's just. I think the gut brain relationship is just so interesting. It's also very, very complex, which makes it tricky, but also very, very fun and very interesting. The immune system, probably the most complex elements of the human body are probably the immune system and the immune system, the microbiome, and neuroscience, and they all kind of merge together in terms of the diet, the gut, and the brain. And I think it's going to be a huge change in the way we treat and prevent diseases through diet, it's going to be huge. And like, the work that you do is incredible in that sense. So it's yeah. So I think a lot of the research I might be doing will be looking into the gut microbiome.
That would be fantastic. I mean, if you can deal with the complexity of pain and look at the different triggers and the complexity of emotions and all these different things that have an interplay with how we perceive pain, I'm confident you're going to do a great job with the gut brain axis and the microbiome. So please do write a book on that, and please do like chronicle everything that you do as you go along, because I would be fascinated to hear your interpretation of the field as it is and where you think it's going as well.
I'm planning to write to see how this goes. I think it's going to be
brilliant. Yeah. No, I'd love that, and please do come on again whenever you want to talk about that stuff, because obviously I love it. So yeah. And if you need any people that you need to interview, I've got a number of suggestions. I'm sure you're already aware of APC and the Night Lab, and obviously Tim Spector's work and stuff. So yeah, I think those are definitely people that you'd want to feature in the book. And that sounds wonderful. Great. Well, thank you so much, Monty. Honestly, this has been such a great conversation. I love the book. I really genuinely love it, and I can't wait for people to read it. It's fab.